Hola, Bernardos. We're ready to move ahead with new content for today on photography and its impact, in my opinion, on painting of the mid-century and the 19th century realism. What you're going to see is that photography is going to have a almost dichotomous kind of history where some people view it as science and therefore a tool, where others are going to be constantly trying to elevate it to the status of high art. Let me show you some very early experiments with photography and give you a little background and context for where we go with the images in the image set. I wanted to show you the very first known image that was affixed basically to a photosensitive plate. The image showed up several years ago on the APAH history exam before we transitioned into the new content set, and students were quite confused by this image. As you can see, it's really, really grainy. There's not a whole lot of detail, and it represents one of the very first experiments in trying to figure out how you take an image from what you see in front of you and affix it to a plate in a way that it won't continue to develop. In the reading that you were doing for last night, you were talking about, or actually reading about, what the challenges were for people who were trying to make these kinds of plates or images without like engraving or etching anything, but simply taking the photosensitive qualities of light and using it to fix an image and make it last. This is basically from the upper story of an apartment building, looking out over the rooftops down below. The image apparently took 8 hours to expose and was therefore, not something that was usable for everyone or easy to understand. Essentially, it used a device that you've heard about before but never seen, the camera obscura. We've been talking about this in Smithsonian quizzes and articles. We've been talking about it with other artists like Caravaggio and Vermeer. And it's basically an artist's tool or device that uses light refracted on the back wall of a chamber that's darkened. The image pops up and is shown in full color and in reverse, and basically gives the artist something to use as a way to examine the composition of a still life or a scene that's been staged in front of the camera, and make adjustments before proceeding to the finished composition. Here you can see in the demonstration, this artist in the mid 18th century is basically copying the outline of an image, much the same way that we would if we were using something like an overhead, right? A projector. So the technology had been known for eons of time. There are even references back to ancient Greece using something with lenses. And we know that artists like Ong were using camera lucidas and other lens-aided devices to get the rich detail that we recognize in their painting. It's these innovations, basically, that are going to make Ong quit painting for a while when the daguerreotype is introduced. And I'm showing you one here. Charles Daguerre was the guy who gave his name to this process. And rather than take a photosensitive plate, he took a copper plate and affixed chemicals to it that were photosensitive. And it allowed an exposure to last and be fixed and made permanent with a lot sharper detail and a lot less time than 8 hours. Here in this image, you guys can see it's a similar kind of vantage point from high up in an apartment building looking down on the street below. The image was exposed and exposed over time, and apparently it looks like an empty street. In reality, it was a very busy street. It's just that the movement didn't allow for images at the street level to affix to the plate. The only image that you guys can see here of a human that actually got caught is this person down right here, who chose to stop long enough to get his shoe shined. And that length of time was enough to give us the blurry image that many people think is the very first image of a person taken with a photograph. We almost take them for granted today. Selfies and pictures, and you guys have an entire social media life that can be very, very different than reality. This is very formative in the stages where we're trying to figure out what photography can be used for, and it will pose a huge problem in the world of art history. Some artists who, champion themselves as people who can capture great detail, like Ong and his contemporaries, will basically have a question, do we continue on with what we did before, or do we change things up and continue to use it as a tool? And you'll get artists in both camps. Delacroix thought that it could be used as a useful tool, and often shows up in the studios exploring photography as a new media. In this particular image that comes from the image set, I'm emphasizing the fact that this is not a photograph, guys. This is a daguerreotype. That means that it's actually on a copper plate, and it's a one-of-a-kind image. There's no reproducing this image from film. Unfortunately, you were reading about what happened to Daguerre's studio. It burned, and we lost a great amount of information about this entire process. There's only 25 that survive today, and this happens to be one of them. Now, the title that I'm giving you there is the atelier of the artist, the studio of the artist. In your image set, it's called Still Life in Studio. And basically, it's been arranged very much like some of the still lifes that we've seen. These architectural images of cherubs' faces and wings, along with that relief of the female nude, kind of conjure up for me a classical tradition. Here, they're probably being used because they're perfect for showing light and shadow, which was one of the things Daguerre is trying to show off. But he's probably also simultaneously trying to elevate this new media to something that can be on equal footing with art. With fine art that you would expect to find painted on canvas or panel in the galleries, right? He staged it in such a way that's sensitive to the raking light that's coming in from the left and shining down on the surfaces. And he's included a variety of textures, the weaving that you see in the basket, the gilt gold that you see in the frame. Here we've got a brass ornament there that shows off its qualities as being metallic compared to the softer matte colors of the plaster. So I think this was intentionally, carefully, and thoughtfully put together to kind of parallel or equal the world of still life that we know from the Dutch. So comparing the two side by side, this is exactly what you would expect, though. Of course, Ruysch's work is in color, and that is part of her appeal. The image on the right was done without the aid of an artist's brush. So it's no wonder that this becomes all the buzz in 1839 when the process is actually released to the public. The French gather people together and demonstrate this in the Academy of Sciences. And from then on, it becomes kind of a history of how to refine the process. And so from these very early grainy images, we will get basically the world's first collection of photographic prints. And that will eventually, in turn, over the century, lead to other developments. I'm going to pause it there and then bring you back to the artist Nadar. Okay.